Hi, welcome back to the video novel Ballads, A Tinker's Dozen. Today we're going to read the first part of the third story about the third song in the book. So if you're ready, kick back and we'll begin. Here we go. This one's called Beat the Drum Slowly. Life ain't fair, and neither are songs nor stories. We left the rancho by the Resaca and Olmito at dawn, the little brick casa of Senor Perez, framed by the 90-foot tall cottonwoods with trunks nearly 5 feet wide, spreading in a friendly V of shade. Senor Perez's family had owned their land since the King of Spain had granted a porciones from the settlement of Reynosa to his great-great-great-grandmother Rosa, on the land that had remained in the Familia Perez ever since. Senor Perez had called on his neighbors and landowners, and 2 weeks later, all of the vaqueros from all of the ranches in our little part of the valley gathered for a roundup. For nearly a week, we rode in great circles, finding all of the cattle that we could and herding them to the open fields just east of El Rancho La Paloma de San Pedro de Carrecitos. By the time that we were finished, we had a respectable herd of almost 1,000 longhorns, ready to be driven first to Laredo and then up to the Shawnee Trail to San Antonio, and finally up the Chisholm to Fort Worth and then Kansas. Senor Perez figured that the drive would take us about 3 months, and he and his neighbors found a trail boss, Bose Eichard. Bose had been freed from slavery, fought the Comanche, and was just looking for a way to make some money so that he could travel to Weatherford and ask a Mr. Parker for his daughter Angeline's hand. I was one of the 9 other cowboys, a cook, One-Eyed Charlie Parkhurst, who was the best cook north or south of the Rio Bravo, and Henry Bourne, we just called him Dutch, a horse wrangler who was as standoffish as a king and as mean as a snake. The drive to Laredo took us nearly 2 weeks. We would have gotten there a couple of days sooner if we hadn't run into terrible lightning and thunderstorm that stampeded the cattle into the arroyos just south of the little Mexican pueblo of San Ignacio. Big Nate Champion's horse got spooked by a rattlesnake, fell on him and mushed in his head. But other than that, the drive was pretty peaceful, even though we had to shoot up a small band of Mexican rustlers. They seemed to think that they could ride into our herd, cut out a few by just yelling and slapping their lassos on the leather of their saddles, or hoping to pick up some maverick calves in the confusion. Texas Jack Baker pulled his Winchester 1873 and put a .44-40 round into the head of the lead rider, and the rest just vanished like a morning's fog. I wasn't able to help much with the bandits, other than to round up the cattle that had spooked back up. I was wearing just about all that I owned, my high-crowned hat with the wide brim. Some folks not from Texas might have called it a sombrero, but it wasn't. It was just useful for keeping the sun's glare out of my eyes, deep enough to make a cup for a drink of water for me or for my horse, and soft enough to be a pillow for my head at night. My red, at least they'd been red when I bought them by now, and had faded to a pretty pink shirt, my trousers, my vest, if it was hot in the summer, but it had many useful pockets and gave me a little warmth in the winter. My good boots and leather chaparajos that kept the thorns from the mesquite and the needles of the nopales from stabbing at me when I was chasing down a wandering calf. My Mother Hubbard saddle that I got from a vaquero who needed money to visit his mother down in Monterey. It was a full double rigged with a flank cinch and California skirts and bent wood stirrups. My bridle, a lariat, a bowie knife, and my father's old .44 single-action Colt Walker would stop a bear or a man, but if it came to fighting, I'd use my fist or my knife unless I really wanted to die. We worked from the saddle every day for 12 hours or so, more or less from before the sun was up in the sky until a couple of hours before evening. Bose picked out a good bedding ground for the cattle, and One-Eyed Charlie prepared our supper, same thing every night. Chuck wagon chicken. Of course, it wasn't anything close to chicken, just bacon rolled in flour and fried in tallow. It was filling. I'd say that about it. One night, one of the cattle pulled up lame, so we were treated to a son-of-a-gun stew. Pedro, one of the drovers, asked One-Eyed Charlie what was in it, and Charlie told him everything but the hair, horns, and holler. We were so hungry that night that we would have eaten them too. My job on the nights that I didn't have guard duty was to clean the dishes and bury the plate scrapings from the squirrel can a ways off from the camp so it was not to attract varmints. Then we'd sit around the fire and Chewy would pull out his little 4-string requinto guitar and sing. Sometimes he'd sing English songs. Most of the boys liked Green Grow the Lilacs, for some reason, the Dying Cowboy. And sometimes he'd sing in Mexican, that slow, sad corrido about the smuggler Mariano Resendez, or a slowed-down huapango from Veracruz, where him and that little guitar were from, but always softly so as not to spook the cattle. We'd drink coffee and settle into our bedrolls, those of us that had them, or lean up against our saddles. It was rare that any of the cowboys would still be awake when Cookie pointed the tongue of the chuck wagon toward the North Star, so Bose would know what direction to head the next morning. I only had guard duty a couple of nights on the way to Laredo. Some of the boys would take a pinch of tobacco and put those rousers underneath an eyelid to help them stay alert, but I didn't resort to that. Most nights were peaceful, and most of the cattle were too. We encountered no hailstorms, no nighttime bandits, and no horse thieves trying to raid the remuda. We were lucky that way.